Thanks for coming out this evening. It's good to see that at 5 o'clock at night there's still some people who want to go to some sessions. So my name is Jeff Wierer. I'm the Technical Product Manager for Exchange Developer Marketing. What we're going to go through today is a drill down into some of the Microsoft workflow technologies. The purpose of this presentation is going to be focusing on the web storage system-based workflow technologies. I will be discussing some of the other workflow technologies that we have. God knows Microsoft has a lot of them. And we're going to be talking about some of the integration and coexistence of those other workflow technologies as well. So my definition of what a workflow is. Workflow is kind of a term that's overused at this point, and it's a bit nebulous, kind of like what is knowledge management. So I like to think of workflow as taking a business process and automating it. And I typically throw workflow into 4 different buckets. The first one I call unstructured or ad hoc. And you can liken this type of workflow to things such as using your Office documents, routing slips, things that fall into that bucket. The second one is for team process automation. So applications where you might be doing document approval or expense report approval. And this is really where the Exchange 2000, and more specifically the workflow engine that comes with the web storage system, excels in. Now, the last two are more of your high-end, high-yield workflows. So you have line of business and production. So that would fall into buckets like your mortgage loan approval process or doing an insurance claim process. And clearly the last two, the line of business and inter-organization, need probably something that's a little more high yield. So you're probably looking at something like doing a BizTalk orchestration around those two processes. So with all the workflow technologies that we have there in Microsoft now, what is our strategy, our back office strategy for workflow? Well, clearly for SQL Server and for Exchange 2000, we wanted to simplify how you build your workflow process, how you add code to your business process. And we wanted to make sure that our workflow technologies worked with off-the-shelf applications. So as I described to you how the workflow engine works with the web storage system, you're going to notice that we don't have to have any client code to execute our business process. We work off the same basic features such as saving an item from Office or posting a message from Outlook into a public folder. All those events can trigger our workflow process. And as I mentioned before, our focus is going to be on the team process automation, approval, review, routing, and tracking. And the focus for how we're going to be doing our workflows with Exchange 2000 is really the Office developer. Okay? So you have a visual tool that allows you to do drag and drop, but in the back end you're still going to be using Visual Basic Script and COM objects. So we're not going to be making this so that you can have a wizard and build your workflow processes. You are still going to be somewhat of a developer to build workflows in Exchange. So let's talk a little bit about the Exchange 2000 infrastructure and the web storage system. And at times I'm going to use these two interchangeably because the web storage system is not unique to Exchange anymore, right? We have products such as Tahoe which are built on the same store. So as I go through the presentation, I might switch up between the technology, but what I'm really talking about is the web storage system. Now, the web storage system, we've added some enhancements for robust workflow. So the first thing we have is a single store for documents and properties. And some people might argue that with an Exchange 5.5 we had a single store for documents and properties. Now the difference that I want to make with Exchange 2000 is we have a single store for documents and properties that's now easy to access. Additionally, we've added support for synchronous store events. So you're no longer tied down to writing the asynchronous event agents that you were in Exchange 5.5. Synchronous events occur before the item is committed to the store, and unlike 5.5 agents, they're guaranteed to occur. And we've also added the ability to do transactions. So unlike Exchange 5.5, you could take multiple objects, multiple items, and commit them to a single folder or multiple folder, all within one transaction. So continuing on for enhancements for workflow, we've also added document level access. And this is one of the largest requirements that our customers and people in the field had asked for. So in Exchange 5.5, you really had to build complex folder hierarchies and setting varying permissions on those folders to kind of do some level of access. With Exchange 2000, this web storage system, we do support document level access control, so you can have different ACLs written to items in the same folder. And one of the other large requests we got from the field was to add universal data access for our data in Exchange 2000. So I'm happy to announce with the web storage system, we now fully support OLEDB and ADO access to the store. Additionally, we've extended the CDO object model. So with CDO 3.0 or CDO for Exchange 2000, it's extensible and you can build processes around that. So you'll see that we've extended it ourselves for CDO for workflow to assist you in building workflow processes around CDO. And then finally, we have sort of a universal access to our applications. So in Exchange 5.5, if you're trying to build a workflow process, you were pretty much limited to what you could do with an Outlook form or what you could rebuild using Outlook Web Access. We don't have the same limitations with Exchange 2000 because we're exposed via the IFS, via the web, and via clients such as Outlook or all of Office. Any of those applications or forms that you use can trigger a workflow process. You're not limited. So how does the workflow engine work? Well, the workflow engine extends the web storage system for simple workflow. And it does that by executing all the transactions on the server itself. So as I mentioned before, we don't have any client code necessary to do your transactions, do your workflow processes. In fact, you could be running from Netscape on a Unix workstation and still be able to perform your workflow. And our workflows are created that you can add them to any existing folder. So when I show you the workflow tool and the ability to create a workflow, you can take any public folder application and enable it through our workflow process. And as I mentioned before, it works with any of the existing forms technology that we have. So what is the workflow? Well, the workflow engine works around a declarative workflow definition. And what I mean by declarative workflow definition is when you create your workflow, you're building a state machine table. It's a little different than some of the other workflow technologies. We're actually a state machine where you track the workflow process through the different states. So as a document changes states, that's how you drive your item through the workflow. And what it does is it allows you to translate your business process into your workflow process. And because it's state machine driven and it's run on the server, it makes it very easy to build tools to manipulate your workflow process. In fact, we ship with a single tool for doing that. But because the workflow engine is a COM-based engine, you could write your own tools to build your workflow process. So as I mentioned, the workflow engine is a COM component. It is fired off by default by events that we create for you using the workflow designer. Because it's COM, you could also access it directly through your own code. And what the workflow engine does is it takes your workflow process definition, your action table, and applies rules to that item in the store. So I'll show you this a little more in the tool, but the first step is building your table. And once you build that table, you set a series of conditions. So I'm going to submit an expense report. And the first condition I have to meet is that the document I'm setting is actually a valid expense report. So imagine that that condition translates to true. So we've checked the content class, and the item is an expense report. Then there's a series of actions we need to apply on that document. And those actions are written using Visual Basic script. So as I mentioned before, you can drive the workflow engine from an event sync. The event syncs that ship with the web storage system power the workflow process. There are 2 event syncs that are registered when you create a workflow. By default, they do the on-sync save, the on-sync delete, and for timer events, we support the on-timer synchronous event. And additionally, it allows you to do user and author security. So I'm going to show you using the workflow session object that we have a simple way of modifying the ACLs on the items that are stored during the workflow process. And finally, all these events call the actual workflow engine, which drives your process. So what I'm going to show you first is a sample application for doing expense report routing. And if I switch here, what I've done is tried to re-implement MS Expense through the web storage system. And I'm not sure if the international subs use the same spreadsheet, but this is the spreadsheet that we use in the US to submit our expenses. And I've modified it a little bit. So we have some of these named cells. And what I'm going to show you is the ability to do property promotion through the web storage system using the Office documents that you have today. So if you check out the properties for this spreadsheet and then choose Custom, you notice I can go through and select certain of the fields and apply names to them. And what these names that I'm giving here are fully qualified namespace. And I don't know if you can see that clearly. What I've done is I've taken the cells and then given them properties that relate back to items in the web storage system. So if I fill out my spreadsheet, I put in my expenses, I have some kind of flight, cost me $200. No one's flight costs $200. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through the process of submitting that report. So I'm going to choose to submit a report, and let me just expand that a little bit. My machine tends to be a little slow. No, that's not what I wanted. Let me reload that. Okay. Let me switch to a different machine. I'll pop it up there in a second. Yeah, it's the joy of doing a live demo. So it works as well as the real Memless expense. Okay, so same view, different machine. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and submit my expense report. And what I'm doing is I'm submitting my document. I'm able to copy that directly into the store using the web folders view, and that's actually submitting it back to my server via WebDAV. Now what's happening in the background, which I can't show you, is it's taking those properties that I specified in the Excel spreadsheet and it's promoting them as metadata within the web storage system. So when the event is done firing, if I switch to my inbox here, when that event is done firing, what the first thing it's going to do is it's going to go through those properties and it's looked up my name. And based on my name, it's going to do an Active Directory lookup and look up my manager and send him an email notifying him that there's a new expense report that he needs to approve. So hopefully this will finish up soon. Ah, there we go. And so here's the new notification to my boss, letting him know that there's a new expense report that he needs to approve. So if I were to click on this item here, it will bring up the expense report. And this is the one that I just opened. And you can see that it took the things such as my name, my alias, my cost center, and the total expenses and promoted them so my manager could easily view that. Now if I wanted to, I could click this here. Clicking on View Report would bring back the same Excel spreadsheet that I submitted. But instead what I'm going to do is go ahead and approve it. And in reality, no one's manager approves their expense report that quickly. And by approving that process, then I'm notified in my mailbox that indeed my expense report has been approved, and then later you're notified that you get your deposit has been made. So this is a really simple application just to show you how you can use the workflow engine behind the web storage system to build team process workflows. So let's talk a little bit about the Exchange Workflow Designer. The Workflow Designer product family, there's actually two in the product. The one that we shipped last year, codenamed Grizzly, originally it was called the Access Workflow Designer. It is now called the Workflow Designer for SQL Server. That one is shipping currently in Mod 9.5 and is going to be shipping in the future releases of Mod for Mod 2000 as well. The new Workflow Designer, the one that I used to build the expense report workflow, was the Workflow Designer for Exchange 2000. And this also will be shipping in Mod 2000 version 1.5. And a copy of Mod ships within the Exchange box. So when you buy Exchange, you'll get a single copy of the Workflow Designer. workflow code. As I mentioned before, we're targeted for the VB script developers, and there is also going to be a new version that's shipping in the Microsoft Office Developer 10 timeframe. So as soon as Office 10 is released sometime next spring, we'll be shipping out with a new version of Mod that has an updated designer. Sure. There's a license for the designer. Once you create a workflow process, unlimited users can access that application, assuming they have an Exchange cal. If you have 10 developers, you need 10 copies of Mod. For a Microsoft Office developer? No, you cannot buy just the workflow designer. It ships with Mod. So if you want the designer, you'll have to buy Mod. So the workflow process definition. So what the workflow designer does, it's an editor for your workflow process definition. It gives you the ability to save, delete, edit your process. Additionally, you have the ability to export your entire workflow process to XML. So then you can create a workflow on a folder, export it to XML, and then re-import it for other folders. So your workflow processes are definitely reusable. And when you build a workflow item, what it does is it persists it as a workflow document, a well-formatted workflow document in the same folder that the workflow then runs in. And there's certain elements that are parts of creating a workflow. So we have 4 of them here. The first is the action table, and that's the series of state transitions that you're going to go through during your workflow process. The second piece, and probably the most powerful piece, is the common script URL, which is a pointer to the location where the script is that is going to power your workflow process. So you build a straight transition table, and then you have VB script in the background that moves your actions along. Now, typically when you build it with a workflow designer, that script is embedded in the workflow item, but you have the optional ability to create a common script somewhere in a folder, and you're able to reuse those scripts in your other workflow processes. We also have a concept of security. So there's 2 security modes, which I'll discuss a little bit later, privileged mode and restricted mode. And then finally, we give access to the audit trail provider. So one of the downfalls of the workflow designer is that you don't have the ability to get real-time debugging. It's not like you're running a component under VB and you can debug it. But we do allow you to access the audit trail provider, which writes, by default, information to the application event viewer. And additionally, if you wanted to write a different audit trail provider, we support that as well. So if you wanted to log to a text file, or if you chose that you want to log to a SQL database or any other kind of database, you could write your own audit trail provider as well. So let's drill down a little bit into the workflow action table. The action table is the table of valid state transitions that your workflow process can go through. If you look at the image at the bottom of our slide here, we have 2 states, pending and approved. And then we have conditions and actions that move the document between those separate states. So the workflow engine reads in the state transition table, evaluates the conditions, such as submit, and then performs some VB script actions based on whether those conditions were met or not. So there's 7 actions that you can use when you're building a workflow script. And you shouldn't confuse these actions with the events that come with the web storage system. The first 2 actions that you can call are onCreate and onDelete. And these 2 actions come by default, right? You have to have a way to add items to your workflow process, and you have to have a way to delete items from there. So the first 2 are actually created by default when you build your workflow process using the designer. The third one, onChange, is really probably where you're going to see most of your efforts in building your workflow processes. OnChange fires anytime a property changes within an item that's stored in the workflow. There's 2 more, onEnter and onExit. And what you would use onEnter and onExit for might not be readily available. Readily apparent, sorry. And onEnter allows you to perform actions before the item enters a state. So if we go back to our example where we had an expense report system, we put an item goes into the submit state. Before it goes in there, we might want to do some sort of validation. The onEnter and onExit allow for those actions to happen. Now, the other thing that onEnter and onExit are good for is setting up for the next action, which is on expiry. And on expiry allows you to set a timer on an item. So if we go back to our expense report example, you can set an on expiry so that every day that your manager hasn't approved your expense report, it will send him an email notifying him that it's still there and they need to approve or reject your report. And you can set those on expiry timers using the on enter or on exit actions. And finally, what we've done is we've allowed you to mail enable your workflow processes by using the on receive action. The on receive action allows you to have email that corresponds to your document. So not all of your workflow processes will be inter-organizational. And in the case that they're not and you want to power them via mail, you will use the on receive action. So what I want to show you now is actually drilling down and using the workflow tool. So this is the workflow designer for Exchange 2000. It's not integrated currently into any development environment, so it's a standalone application. And although it shares the same interface that you might be familiar with the SQL workflow designer, it is a separate application. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new workflow process. And I'm just going to call this my test workflow. And what that's automatically going to do is it's going to set up for the first state transition that I have. So what I'm going to try to do is just model the simple expense report system that I showed you earlier. And my first state is going to be submitted. Now, I don't want to just go to create an item and then submit the item and then go delete it. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that action. And I'm just going to expand this so you can get a better view of what I'm doing. So the next state that we're going to go through in our expense report system is that we need to have our manager either approve or reject it. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a new state just by right-clicking and choosing to add a new state. And my next state is going to be approved. So that'll add another state transition. And what I'm doing by adding these states is I'm in the background building the state transition table that will power my workflow. Additionally, I'm going to insert a state for rejected. And see, these are all the valid states that my document can go through. Finally, we need to add some actions and conditions for this. So if I go back to my submitted state, I can choose to insert a new action. And I'm going to say my action is going to be for approve. So now using those actions that I described to you earlier, I want my approve action to fire off when an item is changed in the web store. So I'm going to choose that to be changed. And I'm going to have it go to the approved state. So now I have a path from the submitted to approved. Additionally, I'll add a new state, a new action, for rejected. This one will also be based on the change event, and on this one I want it to go to the rejected state. Now, items need to be deleted, right? So we can also add a default delete state. So if I insert an action, I'm going to call it delete. If I choose to set it on delete, that will automatically send us back to the final state. So there's no choosing where it has to go. If I'm deleting it, it's eminently being destroyed. And this is how simple it is to create your workflow process in your state transition table. Now, this doesn't do anything if you don't add conditions and actions. So for the first state, if I'm submitting an expense report, the first thing I want to do is validate that I'm actually submitting an expense report. So this might be hard to see, but in the lower left-hand section here, there's a code expression. And you write VB script code that validates the condition. So what I'm going to do is do cbool. So I'm looking for a true condition. I'm going to use the workflow session object and access the fields collection. The fields collection is similar to the fields collection you would get if you were using an ADO record set. And I'm just going to check the DAV content class. That value. And make sure that it is of expense report. Now we have a really advanced debugger for that. So if I were to go ahead and click verify condition, it's going to give me an error saying, oh, you didn't finish off your parentheses. So I'll go ahead, put those in, verify condition, and of course no scripts were found. So if this condition were found to be true, there's a series of scripts we might want to send off. So the first thing we want to do is send a notification to my manager. So what I'm adding here is the actions that are called based on this condition being true. And what I've put in here is a function for send manager message. And what you would do at this point then is write the code in the shared script section for the functions that can be called. What I'll do is later we'll go through the actual workflow process definition that we've had for the expense report system, and I'll show you the actual code that's behind that. So it's pretty easy. The point of showing the workflow designer is it's pretty easy to rapidly develop an application, right? So in 10 minutes, outside of actually writing the code to send a message, which I'll show you later is fairly trivial, you can get up and going and building your processes within 10, 15 minutes. So that was a look at the current shipping version of the Workflow Designer for Exchange 2000. During the Office 10 time frame, we're going to have a new Workflow Designer that's going to be made available. It uses the same state-based design model because we're not changing the engine on Exchange, we're changing the tool for creating it. There's been a lot of enhancement made to it, so instead of being a one-off VB application, they've actually integrated it using the Visual Studio look and feel. So you get things such as a common toolbox and property grid, you get your project explorer. And probably the best feature that we added to it outside of the great enhanced notepad that we had in the previous version was we have a full code editor. So you're going to get statement completion, or what we call IntelliSense, and colorization. Finally, you're also going to get things such as full integration with the other mod tools such as the code librarian. Now I want Workflow Designer. Unfortunately, it won't be demoable for probably another couple weeks. So I had them send me a couple slides of it. So this is actually what the new designer is going to look like. You can see that it has a lot of the same look and feel that you're used to for Visual Studio and VisualStudio.net. And instead of having the plain boxes and lines between them, they've actually added some icons to it so you get a better idea of what's an inflow and what's an outflow. Here's a second look at it showing that you can get IntelliSense and access through the full Visual Studio code debugger, editor, sorry. So the second portion, the piece that we haven't gone through yet, is writing your scripts that power your workflow process. Now, when you're building your workflow, the most important thing that you're going to want to be familiar with is the workflow session intrinsic object. Now, this is an object that's automatically made available to your workflow, and the object is associated directly with the item that's been affected during your process. And it provides a simple method of data access. So anything that you want to do on that item will probably be provided to you through the workflow session. It provides scripts with access to runtime data. So you're going to see that through the fields collection of the workflow session object, you can read or set any property on that item. Additionally, you have the ability to pull out information for the Active Directory. So you'll notice when I submitted my expense report, it sent an email to my manager. And how it did that was using the workflow session object, we have a getUserProperty method that allows you to look up 80 Active Directory properties, such as who I report to in the Active Directory. So we've removed the need for you to write the ADSI code to access the directory for a limited amount of information. Additionally, we have a simplified method for doing item-level ACLs on a workflow item. So with Exchange 2000 and the web storage system, we've moved our security model completely over to the Win32 file system, NTFS file system security model. And historically, writing ACLs on an item would have required writing complicated C++ code. So with the workflow session object, what we've done is we've simplified it by providing you an item readers and an item authors collection, where you simply specify the SMTP addresses of the users that you want to apply permissions to, and the workflow session object in the background goes through all the complicated code of actually setting the ACLs on the item. Additionally, the workflow session object allows simple methods for sending mail. So if you want to be able to work with messages that you received, or if you want to send out notifications, you can use the workflow session object to co-create an iMessage class. And then finally, it provides the access to the audit logging, the audit trail provider, the thing that allows you to write your debugging information back to the event viewer. So I'm going to go back and show you the code behind the expense report system. So I'll switch back to number 2. Number 2. And this is the actual design that I had for the simple workflow process. So you can see that I still only use the 5 states: create, awaiting approval, approved, and rejected. I have a few more flows than I did in the previous example that I built behind you. But we do the same actions that we would. So here I validate that we are submitting an expense report. And then we call a function that I've created, submit expense report. Now, the code is stored in the shared script, but because you probably cannot read that, what I've done is copied it to a Word document. And I just want to highlight some of the things that I've talked about with the workflow session object. So you can see here the first thing that I've done is I've accessed the fields collection. So as I mentioned before, if you're familiar with using ADO, accessing ADO record sets, you can access the fields collection to pull out property information. So I'm pulling out the value for the mail header from. And if we go through the bottom here, I have some additional code. So for instance, I create a function getUserManager, which uses the workflow session getUserProperty to look up what's the email address of my manager in the Active Directory. Now finally, instead of using the workflow session object, I've decided to use CDO to send my mail message. Now what I'm doing here is I'm calling create object to create a new CDO message. Now you normally probably wouldn't do this unless you were in privilege mode. In fact, you wouldn't be able to call a separate object library unless you were in privilege mode. But I wanted to show you that you have the ability to call any COM-enabled object within your workflow process. And then finally, I have a set permissions function, and using the workflow session item authors, I'm able to add an SMTP address to that collection, specifying that this is a user that has author permissions on the documents in my workflow. So it looks pretty simple, right? I mean, I didn't write any complicated VB script to power off that application. Wrong button. So this is a complete look at what we provided you with the workflow session object. And as I mentioned, you should get fairly comfortable with this, because this is really going to be the power behind building your workflows with Exchange 2000. I won't go through everything here. It's just important that you be familiar with some of these things. This is fully documented in the Exchange 2000 SDK. So if you have any questions, you can just drill down into the SDK and look at how actually some of these work. One of the most important ones probably would be the .sender. So if you're looking at the workflow session and pulling back the sender information, that's the actual SMTP address of the person who's performing the action within the workflow. As I mentioned, you have the fields collection exposed so you can read and set properties on the item. Item readers and item authors allow you to do security. And then some of the other methods that are made available to you through the object. So with the workflow engine for Exchange 2000, we have two types of security modes. We have privilege mode and restricted modes. What do I mean by those two modes? So in restricted mode, actions are VB script only. So when I showed you that code example of accessing CDO, I would not be able to do that during using restricted mode. In fact, I can't use create object at all. And the only thing that's made available to you is the functions that are made available through the workflow session object. So what can restricted mode do? Well, you can modify the properties on an item that's triggered in the store. You can send mail through the workflow session object. And additionally, through the object, you can set item level ACLs or access the audit trail. So what's the other side of restricted mode? Well, if you're not in restricted mode, you're in privilege mode. And this allows for free use of create objects. So now you can call any script or any COM object that you have registered on that machine. And these actions that occur under the privilege NT account, which you specify in the component services in the Windows 2000. The workflow process actually runs as a COM Plus application. The account that you specify for the identity of that COM Plus application is the credentials that this works on. So what can you do with privilege mode? Well, almost anything. And that's the danger of giving someone privilege mode. So if you grant a developer access to do privilege mode, he can call any object library on that machine. So you want to be careful on when you grant and how you use privilege mode access to workflow. So the workflow event is fired. The workflow process is actually fired off the event syncs that are registered when you create the workflow definition. Those are the on-sync save, on-sync delete, and on the timer events. As I mentioned before, the workflow process runs as a COM Plus application, and you manage that through the Windows 2000 Administrator Tools Component Services Management Console. Additionally, the workflow event sync enforces security via COM Plus roles. So if you go to manage the COM Plus application through the Management Console, you'll notice that there are two roles by default. The first one is can register a workflow, and it simply is a collection of the people who have the rights to publish a workflow to a folder. The second one is the privileged workflow authors. So this is where you grant that access to have access to all the COM-enabled objects on that machine. And this is also where you're going to specify the identity for the COM+ application. Now, typically what you would do is you create a specific workflow system account, and you keep that account pretty secret because it has access to all the workflow-enabled folders. So I'm going to run you quickly through how you manage roles for the COM+ application. I think I switched to the correct machine again. So if you go through Start, Programs, Administrative Tools, Component Services, eventually it loads up. Choose My Computer, and then you notice of the COM+ applications that are made available to me, one of them that is currently running is the Workflow Event Sync. So there's a couple things you can do here that you should be aware of when you're building your workflow processes. The first is that you can change the identity, and this is where I've specified the identity to be my workflow system account. This is the account that has the privileged access to all the folders that I'm going to workflow enable. And additionally, you set the two roles. So you can see here I have users that can register workflow, so the administrator, myself, and the workflow system account can register workflow. And then for privilege mode access, I have, once again, the same users. Now, one of the difficulties that people have when they're trying to use the workflow designer is they try to run it and it tells them they're getting some kind of error. And usually it's because they've forgotten to apply the proper roles and identities on the COM+ application. There's a series of steps that the SDK outlines pretty much in a cookie-cutter way how you need to apply those. And unless you follow those exactly, you will not get the workflow designer to work. So it's key to make sure that you set those two roles and set an identity. So what about Tahoe, right? Because Tahoe has the same web storage system as an Exchange. Can I use the workflow designer with Tahoe? Yes, but the product, so with Tahoe, we provide basic document management workflow. As of Beta 2, we provide workflows that involve check-in, check-out, approve, and publish. And the key thing to know about the workflows that happen in Tahoe is all of them occur separately of the workflow engine. So while Tahoe ships with the web storage system, they don't build their workflow process, their document management processes around the workflow engine. So here, can I use Exchange Workflow Designer with Tahoe? And the answer is yes, but there's a few things that you should be aware of when you're using the Workflow Designer with Tahoe. So as I mentioned before, Tahoe ships with the web storage system. It essentially has the same database that Exchange 2000 does. And it does include the same COM+ workflow engine. But as I mentioned in the previous slide, they use their own process for doing document management. So the answer is you can use the Exchange Workflow Designer against Tahoe, but you want to use it on applications outside of the Tahoe workspace. So how many people actually are familiar with how Tahoe works? Is it worth going through? Okay, about half. So with Tahoe, and you have your web storage system, and what they've done is they build a workspace folder. And everything below that workspace folder is where you store your workspace folders that have your documents, et cetera, your portals. And you really don't want to write applications below there because they base their workflow process on the event syncs as well. So if you were to write a workflow process in there, you have the chance of corrupting or overwriting their workflow process. But outside of the Tahoe workspace folders is just plain web storage system. So if you want to use Tahoe as a departmental web store, you can build applications outside of the workspace and build them the same way you would build them on Exchange 2000. So the final piece that I want to kind of go through is how we integrate Exchange 2000 workflow and BizTalk orchestration. With all the workflow technologies that are coming out now with Microsoft, there's some confusion on when to use what, which one's better at what, and is there any way to use those two together. So what I want to do is just kind of go through a review of the key highlights of what we've talked about the Exchange 2000 workflow process up to this point. So the key thing to know about the workflow strategy with web storage system is it is a single state machine. And you saw that when I was building the tool, there's a single state table that we're creating. It is event based, so it occurs when you save, delete, or when a timer event fires. And the final thing is it can be message-based or item-based. That's back to our universal access. So it can react to messages in the workflow, or it can relate to email messages in the workflow, or a user changing an item via a web form or an Outlook form. In contrast, we have BizTalk server orchestration. And while you can do a lot of the same things that you could do in Exchange with BizTalk, it actually has support for some things that Exchange does not, such as multiple state machines. And instead of being event-driven, the way the web storage system workflow process is, the BizTalk orchestration is around messages. Okay? So they fire off on email or items sent through message queue, could be an HTTP post, or in fact, it could even be a COM invocation that moves a process along in a BizTalk orchestration. And geared more heavily towards throughput and tracking. So the process of receiving, transforming, and forwarding content step to step through a system. So where does each tool excel? Is one better than the other or not? Exchange 2000 is good for UI-intensive workflow processes, right? Because we have multiple ways of accessing the data, whether it be through Office, through the Outlook forms, or the new web forms technology. The web storage system is good for less structured content. It's a great semi-structured database. We have ease of speed and development, so you could see using the tools that we provide you, even someone who's just somewhat familiar with VB script code can quickly create a workflow process on Exchange 2000. We have the ability to do role-based security. So if you're not familiar with that, you can apply security permissions on an Exchange 2000 folder by using roles, which are outside of having to define users and groups within the Active Directory. And then finally, and the most key thing to take about the Exchange 2000 workflow is that it's really geared for person-to-person or person-to-group workflow processes, those team process-oriented workflows. In comparison, we have BizTalk Server, and that's much better for transactional content. It has the ability to handle multiple processes and do complex auditing. Using its XML transformation, you're able to do data transformation, right? So where Exchange 2000 handles the less structured content, BizTalk actually requires that you format their data in a well-formatted XML document. And if you take anything key back from what BizTalk would be good for, is really those business-to-business or application-to-application processes that you would use. So whereas Exchange would be for your inter-organizational workflow processes, you'd probably want to use BizTalk if you're going to take that process outside of your organization. So which tool went? Well, say you were going to do a policy document approval. You'd probably want to build that application within Exchange. As I described in the last slide, that kind of application has unstructured content, could have varying UI, single information store, and you're really not having to do any kind of data transformation on that item. In contrast, what if we were doing an automated inventory ordering system? With that kind of application, you'd probably want to use BizTalk. Because there you're probably going to require that it be transactional. It's going to go between different organizations, highly structured content. And the key thing here is that there's little or no UI. So there's no user intervention. So is there a place for both of them? Well, say, for instance, you want to do a vacation approval application. You might actually want to use both for that. Because on the client side, you might want to use the U-intensive features, the ad hoc nature of the Exchange workflow process to build the initial piece where you actually go through asking for requesting vacation time off. In the background, though, that small workflow process might kick off a larger BizTalk orchestration that talks to multiple systems. So it's going to handle the transactions to HR, payroll, or your accounting applications. So if I were to give you an analogy between the two different types of workflows, you should think of BizTalk as the forest and Exchange as the trees in that forest. You might have a large multi-state process that stops in several places and waits for a personal or a people decision. It's at that point where you hand it off to Exchange, because those smaller processes are better handled by the web storage system and its workflow. So a wise choice is to use them both. Use BizTalk to move content between organizations, and use BizTalk to move content in and out of the automated systems, and leverage the Exchange workflow to access your user processes when necessary. For further information for doing BizTalk and Exchange workflow, you might want to visit the MSG, session MSG 315, integrating CAM solutions with web services using Microsoft Exchange 2000. I think it runs again tomorrow at 8:30. And just to summarize what we've looked at today, the web storage system ships with a powerful workflow engine. It is enhanced for team-oriented workflow. The workflow engine that we ship with the web storage system is based on state transitions, and it works with any document type that you can store within the store. And we ship with a tool that's available in the box with Exchange and with Microsoft Office Designer. Works with both Tahoe and Exchange and allows you to integrate with other processes such as BizTalk. So there's some resources that you can go for further information. Just so you know that Exchange 2000 did RTM last month. We also have some additional websites. There's the current Exchange website on MSDN. Around the time frame of the MEC, we're going to be putting up a web storage system community on MSDN. So the Microsoft.com/WSS is going to be the home for that. Look for that around the MEC time frame. And if you're using internal resources, you can browse to Exchange Developer. That's where actually you can have an internal link to the current SDK, the current workflow designer. And once again, I want to reiterate that you should follow the SDK instructions for setting up your workflow, or it's just not going to work. Now, I wouldn't be able to leave here if I didn't have a shameless plug for my boss's book. So everyone go out now and buy Programming Microsoft Outlook and Exchange 2nd edition, or Tom will dock me on my review. But it's a really good book. He had a lot of content for Exchange 2000. He does touch on building these workflow processes. So with that, I'm willing to take any question on workflow or actually any Exchange 2000 question that you might have. Yes? So the question is there any major difference between the workflow engine that ships with Tahoe and the workflow engine that ships with Exchange? Essentially, no. It's the same exact thing. In fact, you can use the same tool for both. As I mentioned in the presentation, the key is not to work within their workspace, because their document management process does not use the workflow engine. But when you run the setup for Tahoe, the first thing it says is installing embedded Exchange. So with Tahoe, you get Outlook web access. You get the web storage system. You get the workflow. You get the event syncs. It's almost like a mini Exchange without the mailbox portion. No, you wouldn't store it in a workspace. What happens with Tahoe is they create the workspace folders, and for each workspace, so say I create a workspace, Jeff's workspace, it creates an analogous applications folder. Now that applications folder is not within the workspace. So you'd want to build your workflow process in the application folder that corresponds to your workspace folder. Then you're okay. Yes? The workflow designer for SQL Server, it has the same look and feel, right? But it's powered off SQL. So that happens off of SQL triggers. So it has a completely separate engine. It looks the same. You go through the same process of building your workflow process, but ours is fired off Exchange 2000 events, and theirs fires off SQL triggers. Oh, so the question is, are the triggers created for you automatically using the SQL workflow designer? And the answer to that is I don't know. I don't know. I'm familiar with the Exchange one because I'm part of the Exchange team, but I'm not entirely certain how they build their process in the background for SQL. Well, I can declaratively say why you'd probably want to use Exchange, right? If you're using that collaborative data, right, you want access to your calendar, you want access to email, things like that, then you would build it in Exchange. If you're just doing data transformations, you might only use SQL. And part of that answer is going to be what's your customer using, right? So if your customer is heavily into Exchange, they want collaboration into their application, use Exchange. If they don't need those pieces, it's not worth introducing Exchange, just to do something they could simply do with SQL. Yes? So the question was, can an email trigger a workflow process or trigger an event? And the answer is yes. So workflows fire off the on save, on delete, and on timer events. So if you mail an item, or whether you drag and drop an item or post from a web form, that same on save event is going to trigger. So your workflow is going to trigger. Oh, so you want to know if I can have that trigger off a personal mailbox? So the question is, does it have to be a system? Does it have to be a actual mailbox, or can you email a public folder? And the answer is yes. All public folders can be mail enabled. Anything else? I know everyone wants to go eat dinner, so I won't hold you up. Thanks.